I'm Bronwyn Williams. We're back with the small print, and today my guest is Bryan Caplan. And as always on the show, we like our guests to please introduce yourself the way you would like to be introduced.
I'm Bryan Caplan. I'm a professor of economics at George Mason University and New York Times bestselling author.
Yes, you've written rather a lot of things, and you've written rather a lot of things that people in polite society don't necessarily want to talk about at the moment, for better or for worse. There's an awful lot of self-preserving self-censorship going on in the world at the moment. And being an academic in the middle of the heartland of our current Western cultural revolution, being the United States of America, which we all like basically beneficiaries of your exported culture. Even us here in South Africa, we've grown up with your television programming. We have slight twangs in our accents thanks to your actors and actresses, and we all aspire to your same sort of Snapchat, Instagram filter aesthetic. So we are, for better or for worse, influenced by what's happening in your side of the world, where a lot of the ideas that become norms in liberal democracy or the weird West, and I would definitely include South Africa in that just due to our political and economic history, are coming from. And your latest book is provocatively titled, I'm sure very deliberately, or maybe not at all, completely innocently, How Not to Be a Feminist, among other essays where you touch on...
Don't be a feminist. Don't be a feminist.
Yes, don't be a feminist. Don't. It starts with a letter to your daughter, right? Telling her not to be a feminist. So maybe you want to, in your own words, just explain what your intent was when it came to putting together this collection of essays, which touch on everything from why feminism isn't perhaps a very good idea for empowering women, right through to challenges on government COVID policy and what's happening with social justice movements across the general world at the moment, basically touching on all the taboo subjects that we're not supposed to speak about at the moment. What was your intent in putting these essays out into the public domain for public consumption and critique?
Well, this is one of 8 books of my collected essays. I was blogging from 2005 to 2022 for a website called Econlog. I decided I wanted to go and pick out the best 5% of the things that I'd written and organize them by topic. I thought it made sense to have one that was on the general topic of what people call social justice. Broadly construed. I'd written very widely on that. But at the same time, there was an essay I'd been writing in my head for about 10 years called Don't Be a Feminist, a letter to my daughter. I've been thinking about this since my daughter was born 10 years ago. What do I tell her about this topic? She's going to go to school and come home and people are going to be trying to influence her. And she's going to say, Daddy, what do you think about this? So I was writing this in my head and I thought this was a good time to finally write the essay, which I then made the title. The goal, honestly, is not to provoke. It's to actually change people's minds, but to be candid about it. I've said many times, if the only thing this book accomplishes is it gets my daughter to not be a feminist, I'll consider it totally worth the while. If it's a benefit to anyone else, that's great. Obviously, I am not trying to provoke or antagonize my daughter. My goal is to win her over, and I hope to win over other audiences. Same time, I do like to be straightforward. This is not an essay saying I have a different kind of feminism or there's some issues with feminism, but of course you should be a feminist. It's one to saying to divorce this movement. It is a movement where the main ideas are wrong, and so you don't want to be a part of it.
Well, some of the other things that come through in the book is we talk about what happens when we bastardize, manipulate, or change the definitions of words. So why don't we start right there with that? Because as much as you say we shouldn't be doing this, you have started off the book quite, dramatically saying this is your definition or redefinition of what feminism is. So I'm sure you have your own justification for how you squared that circle. And of course, people that have read the book will see where you're coming from. But in your own words, what is your definition of feminism? So we're all talking about the same thing.
Right. So just to be clear, I don't put forward some new eccentric definition. I claim this is how people actually use the word. And I say that dictionaries have actually been so intimidated by the feminist movement, they're just using a definition that violates normal language. If you go to dictionaries, they will usually say something like feminism is the view that men and women should be treated equally, politically, economically, and socially, something like that. But there's a big problem with that definition, which is we have actual good public opinion data where you ask people, are you a feminist or not? Do you think that men and women should be politically, economically, and socially equals or not? Obviously, almost all feminists agree that men and women should be equal in all those ways. But guess what? Almost all non-feminists also believe that men and women should be equal in all of those ways, which means it's a terrible definition. It doesn't distinguish the feminist view from that of other views. So that's where I said we really need to think more about how people actually use the word. And I say a much better definition of feminism, it is the view that our society generally treats men more fairly than women. It's the view that our society generally treats men more fairly than women. This is one that I say fits actual usage. If someone says, I'm a feminist, but I think that that the women get fantastic treatment in our society and men are oppressed, you would just be confused. It's like, well, in what sense then are you a feminist? Right? And on the other hand, if there was someone says, I'm not a feminist, but we are so terrible in how we treat women, it's despicable what we do. Again, that would be strange, would just violate normal usage. So I say this actually picks out the way people use the word, because in fact, almost everyone who identifies as a feminist does believe that our society treats men more fairly than women. And out of people who say they're not, there's a bit more of a range between just agnosticism, I don't know, or just saying, no, I disagree. So that's where I think that it is useful. And again, of course, I don't see any reason why feminists should actually disagree with this. And if you go and read the more thoughtful definitions, they'll often, in the second or third sentence of the paragraph, say, this is based upon a view of society's oppressive towards women and so on. So I think it's not even that different from what many feminists think. But what's useful about my definitions, it just gets the conversation moving to the question, all right, well, is that true? Is it actually true that our society generally treats men more fairly than women? It can't just be that women endure some unfairness, because guess what? Everyone endures some unfairness. There's got to be some kind of a comparative standard. Once you open that up, then we are ready to go and actually look at the world, which is what I really like doing. I don't actually like arguing about words. I like arguing about reality, but sometimes the words are just so confused that I've got no choice. And this was one such occasion.
But you've chosen to take your position, or to build your hill in the middle of a battlefield where it's all about words. I mean, I don't even want to go down that whole road, but even within your definition, we've got another sort of whole infinite turtle situation there, is when we get very quickly to, okay, then how do you define women in this particular context, which has also become part of the general discourse around this particular topic. But I do like your definition in that it's more than just, as you were getting to right at the end there, it's more than just a definition. It's also a claim, a statement, and a hypothesis, if you will, that can then be tested and interrogated, which is what you do a little bit of in your book. Obviously, other people have written on this topic too, and we'll move away from this particular essay in a second. But I do like a couple of the points that you've made there that I myself have made as a woman in mixed society, and have been not very far short of actually burned at the stake for daring to sort of comment on things like the whole sort of abortion versus male child support questions. Maybe in your own words, you can just describe the point that you make there before I put words into your mouth, because I've made very similar points in public platforms myself, and it didn't go down so well. But so I'm astounded at your bravery that you were able to say these things as a man.
Well, thank you very much. I do have tenure, and I consider it actually part of the duty of someone with tenure to stick their neck out and say things that other people are afraid to say. Right? Yeah. So now, to be clear, the essay was written before Roe versus Wade was overturned, and the change in the law complicates things a little bit, although ultimately not that much.
Do you want to elaborate on that for our listeners here who are not Americans? Like, I know a bit about it.
So, I mean, I think this was probably international news. But yeah, so for roughly 50 years, the U.S. had a Supreme Court case called Roe versus Wade that said that it was illegal for states to ban abortion during the first 2 trimesters. The U.S. has a very federalist system, so each one of the 50 states can have very different laws. During COVID, there were states that were basically super locked down, and others that almost immediately reopened and barely anything changed. And that's because these were state level policies. So abortion traditionally would have been like that. But there's a 50-year period when there was one federal policy created by the Supreme Court. And then this summer, there was a case that did not in any way ban abortion. It just said it's no longer going to be something the federal government is involved in. It's up to each state. All right, so that was the change that happened after I wrote the essay. But in any case, in states where abortion, in states where well, actually, so there's a few states now, after, so by the way, after states did go after there was return to the states, there are a couple of states where abortion is just completely banned. Almost all of them, it is just a different cutoff in terms of the earliest time or the latest time that it is allowed. But anyway, so let's just go back to before this decision, because it simplifies everything, and we can talk about it more if you want to. So anyway, the law in the U.S. was that, first of all, so women had an absolute right to get an abortion anytime during their first 2 trimesters. But if she did decide to have that baby, the father was responsible for child support for 18 years. And most notably, if he were to say, look, I don't want this baby, and so I want to wash my hands of any responsibility, that didn't matter at all. He was still on the hook. And furthermore, this would even account for a married couple where if the father says, I don't approve of this abortion, it's like, well, too bad, tough luck. Doesn't matter that we're married. Whereas if the mom said, I want to go and have this baby anyway, then the dad is on the hook for 18 years. But even for a one-night stand, in principle, you would be on the hook for 18 years and with no choice in the matter. So it does seem to be a pretty big asymmetry.
Yeah, so motherhood is opt-out or was opt-out, and fatherhood is no opt-out.
That's correct. Now you can say in the states where there are restrictions on abortion, you could say that both parents are dealing with the same situation.
But though you say that Roe versus Wade is overturned, in principle, if you want to talk about this at a very high principle-based level, a mother can still give her child up for adoption, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course, that was always legal.
Yeah, I know. Obviously, there's a whole lot of other things that happen along the way. I have a child of my own. Right. I know all those stories, but that's a
little more complicated because there would actually be a legal problem in the U.S. for a mom to give up her baby for adoption over the objection of the father. So even for a one-night stand, I think that the father could go and say, no, I want the baby. And then you can't give it up for adoption. You have to give it to me if you don't want it. But this is getting into
effectively a mother is not committed financially to 18 years worth of child rearing unless she chooses to do so, or at least doesn't make a choice not to do so.
Right. Now, as to what's the father, if there were a father who said, I want the baby, could he go and then sue the mom for child support? So it would hardly ever happen. But I think a good lawyer might be able to do it. So it's
Is there precedent for that? I don't know. If it's been legally adopted, I don't know.
No, but it's the case where the father blocks the adoption, says, I want it, and then also pay me. I think you could try it anyway. It almost never happens.
You can try all sorts of things in legal courts. I mean, we've got amazing laws here that adult children who have jobs can still sue their parents for lifestyle or for living standards, top-up maintenance.
Wow. Yeah. So you're like in Italy.
Yeah, and by the same token, parents can sue their children for old age maintenance, which is also hugely like, what? None of us asked for that.
All right. That's weird.
That's weird, right? Like, yeah, the law is a strange beast. It's made up of popular opinion, right? Sooner or later.
And chaos.
And chaos, yeah. It's a sort of a one-size-fits-all trying to solve a personal problem that goes on. But anyway, to get back to the point that you were trying to make in the book there is that discrimination works both ways if we are going to start to interrogate things like your definition of what feminism is, which is a strong claim to open with. So don't be a feminist as like a provocative statement. When you start to interrogate these ideas, like you're saying, they're not designed to be provocative. Well, maybe the title was. I mean, like, let's be honest, you're an economist. You do understand that catchy titles, just like clickbait articles, are more likely to jump off the shelves and get people's attention, get them to open the book and get outraged in order to engage with the story and continue the conversation. So I won't let you off the hook too easily in that regard.
Well, I say, look, I'm all for catchy titles, but I would only do a catchy title that honestly describes the content.
That you can back up. That you can actually back up what
I did here.
No shame there. I'm completely pro self-promotion and clever wordage. Like, I'm definitely not going to criticize you for that. But I think it's worth pointing out that it's quite good marketing to get people talking, engaging with conversations such as this. But that's by no means the only topic that you go into in this book. You go into a lot of topics quite similar to what like Douglas Murray's done in the UK, built a whole sort of career around basically, poking or pointing out where the naked emperor is in fact naked and a lot of the sacred cows in current discourse. So maybe you want to go into some of the other ones that you want to pick up. I don't know, like COVID policy was touched on quite briefly as to what happened there, but you also had quite a lot in terms of what's going on with other forms of discrimination or with anti-discrimination policy. And you use in your book, which I think is going to be a bit of a controversial topic, you compare basically sort of McCarthyism, communist witch hunts that took place in your country once again, sort of mid last century, to some of the sort of the sin finding, or as you term them, I think in a couple of times in the book, sort of struggle sessions around other ideological dissenters in society right now, specifically around issues of discrimination around particularly racism and sexism. How did you manage to justify making that parallel? Because I think that's one that you could get into some trouble with, in that a political ideology, which is what one of the first criticisms I'm sure you'll get, is a choice that we make, right? Like whether we choose to be feminist or not, quite different from the choice of the sort of body that we find ourselves in. So yes, again, how did you come up with that analogy? I know it is effective, but it's also it could be criticized from different angles.
Well, so like your viewers have heard of McCarthyism. There was a period in the U.S. where if you go to a U.S. history class, there's some kind of persecution against not only actual communists, but people who just seem kind of like they're communists.
Or just generally anti-government yes. in one way or another, right? So whether, again, it could be
like McCarthyism was specifically about communism, or something where it seemed like you were friendly to communism. Now, what's striking is most of what went on with McCarthyism was official discrimination for government jobs, for example, for university professors. The University of California at Berkeley, which is where I was an undergraduate, there was a lot of media coverage of how for certain departments, they were actually having a policy where not only do you have to write a diversity and inclusion statement where you describe your political views, but also it doesn't even go to the department until it gets passed by a review committee of diversity and inclusion bureaucrats. Furthermore, the rubric was so strict that you must, in fact, be an activist in order to pass. Right? So essentially, Berkeley has, for some departments, instituted a full political test for eligibility for employment as a professor, which then made me wonder, well, so what were the McCarthyite policies of Berkeley during the McCarthy era? I was able to track down exactly what those policies were. And the punchline is that there is simply no doubt that modern policies are stricter than those that existed during the McCarthy era. In the McCarthy era, all you had to do to be eligible for employment as a professor was just to say that you were not an actual member of the Communist Party and or any other group that favored the violent overthrow of the US government. All right, so in other words, during the McCarthy era, you could, with perfect honesty, go and sign the statement, even though you are, in fact, a Marxist-Leninist, if you just don't belong to the Communist Party. Right? That was all that the standard was for in the case of UC Berkeley. Whereas now you are actually unemployable as a professor in the affected departments unless you actually not only say, I agree with this stuff, but personally are involved as an activist. So there I would just say this is one case where the facts are just clear that we are now, that the persecution is now harsher than under McCarthyism. And then, stepping back more generally, right? What I say, people often think of McCarthyism as a witch hunt, right? Well, there's something, one obvious thing going on, which is actually was a communist party in America, and there was a Soviet bloc, which was conquering countries at the time. So just to compare it to a witch hunt in the first place is a bit odd because witches are imaginary, as we know, right? But anyway, one of the main complaints about the McCarthy era was that there was an expansive notion where if you weren't able to find actual communists, then you'd find someone who's a friend of a communist or someone who said pro-communist things, right? And then to go and contrast that, though, with what's going on now, in the US, it is almost impossible in real life to find actual vocal racists or sexists, right? Which is why we have concepts
I could challenge you on that point. Like I could definitely find specimens.
Yes, you can. Well, you can find them on the internet. I'm talking about finding them in real life. like meeting them and have someone say, "Hi, I'm a racist."
Unfortunately, in the country that I live in, it would be absolutely disingenuous for me to say that I have not met those characters in real life.
Are they public about it?
Well, public and private, right? So in mixed company, they might reveal their true colors, right? If they think that you look like them, and perhaps then also think like them. I don't know how it is in your country.
Say, "Hi, I'm a racist."
I have to make that point. There are racist, sexist people, and particularly people who are racist and sexist at the same direction, right? You know, towards, unfortunately, where I am, and it often takes place in, as I said, mixed company, private. So you wouldn't be saying that on the internet, because we literally have laws against that, and we have sent racists to jail, right? We have actual anti-racism laws. Yeah, there's been some very, very sort of high-profile cases there. But at the same time, people that think if you look like them, if you think like them, will say terrible things as soon as they don't believe they are being recorded. Although we should all believe we're being recorded all the time, if not by your government, by your insurance company who has trackers everywhere. That's a different story for a different point. So I would challenge you on that point. I think there are.
So again, I mean, I am talking I am talking about the United States, where I've got lots of experience. Although, I've been to a lot of other countries. It's, look, if you go and Google them and try to introduce yourself, you can actually, it is possible to meet racists, but it is,
a self-acknowledgement.
The odds you would ever bump into one, or, pardon? Yeah, so the odds that you would ever bump into one, like, extraordinarily low, that you would see one on TV, extraordinarily low. But this doesn't mean that it doesn't stop people from claiming. Instead, there's just a changing of the standard, all the way to the level of the slogan, "White silence is violence." There was a restaurant in DC where a bunch of protesters just went and yelled at a bunch of people eating in a restaurant. And like, why? Well, you're sitting there eating instead of fighting racism, and that really makes you a racist. Like, it's kind of violence just to be minding your own business and eating. That is especially a strong case. But yes, there is like an idea where we're just going to change the standards so it's racist simply to be opposed to having racial quotas in hiring, for example. Right? I point out that you can always go and find communists, witches, or racists if you just change the standard enough. You just say, yeah, well, a witch is anyone that doesn't fight witchcraft all the time. If you don't do that, then you really want to be part of the problem. You're a witch too. And then, all right, fine. I guess there are witches.
Yeah, I suppose that's exactly the case. I mean, like, I know Hilary Mantel, the author who wrote about the whole Henry VIII dynasty, she's just died, and that was the whole thing of the actual witch hunts that took place in England that were often used for political ends. She wrote quite a lot about that in that sort of Wolf Hall trilogy, talking about exactly that, where if you change the definition, like, it gets to the Monty Python level eventually. So like, if you're rich, if you float, or and you're dead if you don't, right? So it's like
or there's also anyone who questions the existence of witchcraft must be a witch.
Yeah, there's once you're in the Inquisitor's hands, then there's no way that you're innocent. One way or another, you're guilty. It's just a case of how long it is to get to that point. But are we being disingenuous again, talking about those really atrocious periods in history and comparing them to what's happening now? Is it not just a political, or it's more like a battle of words at the moment? Or do you feel from your perspective that there's a real danger of these things turning into actual dangerous situations for people, whether it's economically or physically speaking? I know you said like McCarthyism, in your view, isn't a witch hunt, because again, there's like definitely periods in history we can point to which had much more dramatic fallout from these sort of ideological sort of cleansing or struggle type sessions, whatever you want to call them, through history. But McCarthyism was dangerous. Like, there were people who were kind of removed from the public eye. People did go to jail, right? There was at least
it was a very small number of high-ranking members of the Communist Party USA.
Yeah, but the point is, there was some danger.
There were a few.
In the current situation, and sometimes all you need is a token scapegoat to sort of scare everyone else into falling in line. At the moment, what is the actual threat level from these differs of opinion, which is what they come down to? These differs of opinion over personal facts, or over sort of definitions of words, or over who should get jobs in public or semi-public sector type places. Is it not just a case, like some people would say, that basically, free speech is free, but it's not unlimited, and there are consequences for your opinions. And if your opinion's not popular, then you should sort of deal with that, because the popular popular opinion has shifted, and if that's the worst consequence, is that as dangerous as it gets? Or is there something more, in your view, insidious here that could be pointing towards a real physical danger from the trends that you're describing? Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
so
are we just
actual,
thinking
yeah,
about
so
it
actual
insensitive?
physical danger, I think, is low. And I don't think that's going to get much worse. I think what's really, what is actually already happening in universities to a high degree is if you have the wrong opinions, you're simply unemployable as a professor. But then also this is expanded out to to normal areas of the economy. Meaning, I was experiencing this for many years as a professor, and my reaction is, all right, well, it's terrible for me, but it's not a big problem for the world. When I started talking to people with totally apolitical jobs who then said I have to go and do training where some dogmatic person goes and tells me their political opinions as fact, and if I don't pretend to agree, I will be punished. But in terms of, if you make the point of, well, isn't this just a case of your opinions are unpopular, then you
That's the
face
argument
consequences.
often presented,
Yeah,
right?
and this is actually a case. Well, first of all, I would say that I think it is actually true to say that the popular opinion is the one that's getting punished. As the popular opinion is, well, there is a problem, but you're exaggerating. But people don't feel free to say that because the activists are so aggressive. But I think, what's really going on here is it's not just a matter of social pressure. In the U.S., this is heavily influenced by discrimination laws, where essentially, if you were a business, you don't want to be doing less than your competitors in a visible way, because otherwise you are vulnerable to lawsuits. So this is a case where people pretend it's just a matter, oh, well, this is just that it is an unpopular idea. It's more along the lines of activists have weaponized the laws to say that anyone that doesn't agree with me is, in fact, either discriminating, or if you're not dealing with this in a decisive manner, that's discriminating. And so it really is a case where there is a major conflict between civil liberties as traditionally understood and what we call civil rights, where because we are so worried about stamping out even the slightest vestige of discrimination, no one is allowed to criticize, no one is allowed to say, well, wait a second, the person isn't qualified. And again, not just in academia, which has had these problems for decades, but normal jobs too.
Okay, so they are like actual economic consequences. I mean, it's almost like the turning the trite little taunt that's actually completely idiotic when you think about it on its head, like the whole go work, go broke. It's kind of the opposite in a very tangible sense. If you don't go work, you are there. There are many ways you can go broke.
Here's what's going on.
From a consumer activism, a legal lawsuit point of view, there's not being able to get into the job market. There's a very strong incentive for what does Nassim Taleb call it? Like in terms of the tyranny of the minority, that the squeakiest wheel gets the pervasive way. When it comes to issues where one side has a strong opinion and where even a very large majority that just doesn't actually care to engage in these issues or has no opinion or has a counter opinion, essentially, if they don't have strong enough opinions, that opinion won't sway. It will be the person with the strongest opinion in the room and the strongest incentive to exercise their opinion, which ends up swaying and changing the sort of the general meter of society.
Right. Well, there's two things going on. So first of all, it is true that woke activists just care more and they're angrier, and this makes it possible for them to get their way. Right. And that's something where you say, well, that's part and parcel of free speech, that the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Yeah.
But what I say we have in the US is something quite a bit worse. It's the one where even if there was a business where the boss disagreed, he would still have to say, yeah, but I'm going to get sued if I go and am vocal about it. So, what you can see in the US is that there are almost all major corporations will pay lip service to left-wing values because they're worried about them. But furthermore, if you were someone that says, well, we're not going to do it, imagine if you're a major corporation, you say, we're going to put up a bunch of signs saying, don't make false accusations of racism or sexism against anyone. We harshly punish false accusations, right? That which seems like a perfectly reasonable thing, but that is just the kind of thing that would get you sued. So it is a case where we combine your tyranny of the minority with a legal system that is stacked in favor of their position, pretending that it's not political, but of course it is political.
Yeah, I mean, politics and economics is so closely entwined. It's about the rules of the game, what we can and cannot do. And some of those rules are legally enforced, and others of them are more socially enforced. And one of the comments you made
the nice thing about socially enforced rules is you normally get some diversity. So you don't like it, you go someplace else. Legal enforcement is what gets you true uniformity.
Well, you go somewhere else
really,
if you can't go somewhere else. I mean, one of the big issues in your book is the issue of immigration, right? And there's like fixed and frictional costs in terms of moving, not just even moving from one country to another, but moving from one town to another that has a particular political view. There are actual costs to that, right? So there's a lot of disincentive not to, participate in whatever the prevailing social norm is, even if it's not even the majority's view, but if it is the prevailing norm. That's the whole like sort of social cooling phenomenon, right? Where we can all actually believe B is the case, but because the social norm says A is the case, we all go around pretending A is the case, right? Like just nodding and smiling at the at this thing. So we can all end up lying when we don't feel like we're comfortable enough to sort of express our viewpoints. But I did want to go back to one of the points that you made quite clearly in the book, and quite a small little paragraph, but it's something that I've thought about before in terms of the work that we do with our clients and what we do, trying to explain changing consumer mindsets. And that's the idea of the sort of anti-consumer. Like businesses do respond to capital incentives. Businesses are not people. Businesses are not emotional. They respond to market incentives, right? I mean, it's basic supply and demand. You give people what they want to buy. But most businesses have focused really up until quite recently in capitalist society or capitalist-ish society, let's be honest. I mean, we have financial socialism all over the place at the moment, but that's beside the point. But the point is most businesses made decisions in order to make their target markets happy, right? So to give value to their target markets. But businesses now have another equation they need to balance, and that is that they have to make decisions for people who will never be their customers in order for that group of people not to damage their business. So businesses used to be going for the plus side of the equation, like pricing correctly, making marketing offers, product price place promotion in order to attract people to their side. Now they have another front where they have to actually make decisions to defend against the anti-consumer who's never going to be their target market. So we even have businesses spending money on ad campaigns that will actually perhaps reduce their target market size in order to defend against the chance of being negatively attacked by people who are not even part of their target market group. So you've got the target market and the anti-target market, which is, I think, something that not all marketing managers, business leaders have actually explicitly understood, but that's what they're doing when they play lip service.
What's a major example of what you're talking about?
Sorry?
What's a major example of what you're talking about?
Oh, we can see with what takes place when a brand takes a decision on a political issue, even if they're a non-political brand, like when a soap bar product, like not even a ladies soap bar product, like a cleaning detergent you use in your kitchen takes a view on a social justice issue, for example. That's not going to get them to sell more soap, but it is going to get them to make sure they don't get attacked by people who will then tell them to go to another brand, right? So there's a very different thing between communication and marketing piece that's designed to attract people to you, and then one that's designed to stop people from harming you. And we see quite a lot of that in how advertising.
Even there, that's sort of based upon your customers care what the social justice activists think, right?
Yeah, and in some cases they absolutely do, if that's what the brand's being built on. But when you see very sort of mundane brands that are targeted at parts of the society that don't actually have access to exercise these sorts of luxury value propositions, right? They don't even have the language to engage these debates, because these debates that we're having right now, as we open with today, are highly centered around words, right? You have to have a certain degree of education and a certain degree of access to society and discourse in order to even understand what we're talking about right now. Not because people don't understand the English, but because there's a whole lexion around these issues that insiders understand and outsiders don't. And when you see brands using insider language to talk to consumer groups that clearly don't engage in that sort of verbiage in their day-to-day life, like any market researcher would tell you, this is far from being this person's primary concern. It is just a very interesting phenomenon to see businesses switching budgets to defense, not only to offense, because business has always been a offense game, right? I think it's quite interesting.
I mean, there's probably some of that. I'm actually also inclined to the idea that a lot of top corporations have been somewhat hijacked by left-wing fanatics who are just ignoring the fact that a lot of their customers don't like it. If you look at ESPN, do you have ESPN in South Africa?
And when we know of it, like occasionally we watch some of that stuff.
It's the cable sports network. So now the people watch ESPN, this target audience does not want in general to receive left-wing.
They're there to watch sports.
Right. They want to watch sports. They are not very interested in women's sports generally, and yet ESPN is going and pushing it on them. I think this is because they are owned by Disney, and the people at the top of Disney are pushing an agenda.
Well, if they
as to what's
don't,
going on, what's going on, I think a lot of it is just that hostile takeovers have been so regulated that it is possible for people that get to the top of a very successful corporation to go and waste a lot of shareholder value pursuing their own agenda and not get thrown out because it is so hard to do a hostile takeover under U.S. law.
But I would challenge that in saying that, is that actually wasting shareholder value, or is it becoming a necessary business defense to actually play on the defense sort of side, to expend budgets in order to defend brand reputation? And that's coming back to your point as to in terms of the actual costs incurred here, right? So if you don't like write your creative essay of allegiance that you can come back to again, when you say at the universities, it's not just a case of like swearing an oath towards being an anti-racist good guy and that you buy into all the good ideas of the day. You actually have to sort of motivate that in terms of your augment that in terms of your personal belief, value statement, and get a score out of that, right?
That's why I chose the example of ESPN. It's very hard to understand that how ESPN is making more money by treating their customers this way. I don't
it's not about making more money.
What non-sports fans would do if ESPN just ignored them and gave sports fans what they wanted is unclear. There's this great line from Michael Jordan where he said, "Hey, Republicans buy shoes too." That is a deep insight. It's one that, again, you could say, well, the left cares more, and there's something to that. But when something like ESPN, it just seems like they are going out of their way to alienate their own customers.
Isn't that still only if you're looking at the top end of the equation, right? Like, again, if like traditional business that only had to fight the fights on the one side, fighting for your target market's share of a wallet. But now you've kind of got that other sort of externality cost, which you got in politics quite a lot, what you get when you've got like trades and tariffs. It almost becomes a tax that you've got to pay in order to play the game in society. Like you have to throw money as part of your business plan, and all your competitors have to do it too, right? So it becomes like a deadweight loss, a new deadweight loss that we're building into society, where you have to allocate a certain amount of budget essentially to social justice, which many people would say is a good thing. This comes back to the whole sort of stakeholder capitalism thing, which I'm hugely skeptical of because I understand incentives, and of course the recent ESG news just like puts paid to the idea that capital should really be responsible for saving the planet or for doing good in any sort of way other than doing good by their customers. But the point is, we basically built a dead weight in economic terms. Again, not pointing to what your morality or politics are, make your own choices, listeners, but it's an extra cost of doing business in today's society. It's kind of a bill you have to pay that doesn't add value to your shareholders, but it does defend your shareholders against getting their value eroded by an external threat, by getting sued, by getting
again, I would just say that
it's down. Or in my country, we literally have a political party that will go to your stores if you fall foul of their ideology and beat up your staff members, loot your stock, and in all your branches. And if they do like a coordinated attack on your brand because you said something naughty in an advert, right? Like there's a defense cost here that's becoming something that is necessary to defend shareholder value. I certainly see that. Maybe you disagree, but I see it as a new deadweight loss we're building into business. And because everyone's doing it, everyone else kind of has to do it.
Yeah, so I think that what you're talking about goes on sometimes. I think a lot of this, at least in the U.S., is driven by law, not by consumer demand. Again, like it's one you look. There are some products where I think you're exactly right. So if you are running Whole Foods, you need to be your customers tend to be left wing. You're very concerned about their opinion. You don't have many right wing customers. ESPN, on the other hand, is one where I think it would be more profitable for them to just say, look, we are apolitical. We are just here to go and do sports. We're not here to advance an agenda. If women's sports don't get people watching, then we're not going to go and air them. And that's just what we do. So again, I think it does vary. Like I said, there is the issue that if you were to very visibly take a stand against it, then probably you'd get sued into the ground, which is sort of a legalized version of getting your store looted. In the U.S., at least, we still have very little politicized looting, if anything. Normally, looters just loot what's nearby. There isn't much of a plan to it. But I think that the idea that lately there are some important corporations where just the people that happen to be running it are very left wing and are taking advantage of that to go and pursue their own agenda to the detriment of shareholders, all things considered, I think that's also going on.
I'm also a bit surprised that you do refer to it as left wing. Again, that's probably an American way of looking at things, where you have a very binary sort of political system. Pick a color, pick a set menu, pick a color T-shirt, and stick with it. You've got to swallow the whole dinner wholesale. But what you're really talking about here is the extreme end of the wedge, because 50% of your country is not an extremist, like on either side of that line. Instead, it's again this sort of like the two poles seem to have been hijacked by, again, the minority views, right? So it's
right. But I would say that like American corporations barely or care at all about what extreme right wing people think. So again, when I was young in the 80s, they would care about what religious groups think. Now I think that almost no major business gives a damn about what religious groups think, partly because religious people don't care as much, but also because the people at the top of major corporations are rarely themselves religious. So it's just not a cause that they want to go and put any effort into.
Well, then why does if you can sort of summarize what we've been saying, why does the left-wing extreme fringe scare businesses and the right-wing extreme fringe doesn't enough to take financial choices that would, at a superficial level at least, seem to be anti-maximum profitability?
Yeah, so part of it is just that the left cares more. That one is consistent with profit maximization. It's like, well, we pander to the people that care. Part of it is that the law is really 100% in favor of the left-wing view. The odds that anyone would ever be sued for discriminating against someone for being white or Christian or male is just vanishingly low. And so the law is basically always in the background as a threat of last resort against a business that says we're just not going to go along with this stuff. And then finally, the important thing is that now the left-wing view is the elite religion. It's the religion of the top of society. And since the top of society tends to run things when they happen to get an opportunity to go and push their own personal views, that's the personal view that gets pushed.
Well, that's an interesting position to take, because what you're essentially saying is that the left wing, whatever that might be in terms of the way you look at things or the definition you want to give that, has more economic clout. Either that they have more spending power, that they do spend, or that they have more influence in terms of being tastemakers.
Yes. Again, like I said, there's always the threat of the law backing them up, which means that it would be very hard for a corporation to say, we're not going to go along with this stuff. Then you probably would get sued into the ground. But yeah, I mean, if you just go into, again, you can take a look at people that are running top corporations tend to come from very good schools, and the graduates of good schools are very left wing now. So they have a special position, even in terms of income. I mean, the income correlation has switched a bit, but it's more along the lines of the social elite as opposed to the economic elite is especially left wing, right? But so that social elite and the economic elite is sort of combined in top corporations. In more mid-sized businesses, then there's a division. Like the guy who's the CEO of a very successful plumbing firm is probably not left wing, but he doesn't have the influence of Disney, for example.
Well, I'm going to be provocative then, because like in your book, you do touch on one of those other absolute taboo topics. You talk about the sort of correlation of IQ and life success outcomes. Are you not really painting yourself into a corner by like basically stating that people in the left wing in your country are effectively, de facto, more successful, wield more power, have more influential positions, make more money than people on the right? I mean, I probably agree with quite a lot of your views, but I like to think that I can probably think along the lines of what someone wanting to challenge you would be, especially if you read everything you've put together in this latest book. That's a pretty provocative.
That's one where I would just say that it's just a question of the data. So in earlier periods, there really was very little correlation between political views and IQ, but that has changed in the last 10 years. So in the last 10 years, you're going to see the education correlation. Education correlates very well with IQ. And over the last 10 years, there's been a big switch of highly educated people being evenly split between Democrats and Republicans to being very Republican. So again, this may mostly be a U.S. thing, but a large education gap has opened up between the parties. So again, that's just facts, which has to be acknowledged, whatever you think about it.
Yeah, well, so many uncomfortable facts, but that's what economists deal in. You got to deal in facts, right? You got to start with what is, not what ought, before you can even start to sort of answer those questions. But anyway, that's a very uncomfortable rabbit hole. The other points I wanted to get to is you had like a little section in your book dedicated to Gary Becker, which is great. He always comes up in my sort of economics sort of nerd group circles quite a lot. Do you want to give 5 minutes shout outs to the great Gary Becker and the key point that you wanted to take away from his work and put into these fraught conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. Gary Becker is the first major economist who thought about discrimination. The question that he started with is, well, if you're profit maximizing, would you discriminate? Would you go and refuse to go and hire people who are equally productive of another group just because of that? And the answer, of course, is no. And the next question is, well, suppose a lot of other people were discriminating. Does this create a profit opportunity? Yeah, totally. If it were really true that women were paid 30% less than equally qualified men, there would be a no-brainer get-rich-quick scheme that any business could adopt. Fire all your men, replace them with women who are just as good but make less money, and then clean up, because labor costs are a big part of costs. You can be, it would be a tactic that almost anyone could go and pursue to get fabulously rich if the premises were true, which strongly suggests that the premises are not true. Right.
Assuming, of course, businesses are profit maximizing machines and they're not actually run by just general asses, right? I mean,
they're run by humans, but then Becker also at the point of, look, suppose that some businesses discriminate and some don't. Well, the ones that don't will have higher costs than the ones that don't discriminate will have lower costs than the ones that do.
There's a cost to being a jerk.
Yes. And over the long run, that we know there's a strong tendency for higher cost firms just to go out of business and shrink, and for lower cost ones to stay in business and expand. You can see this in things like unionization in the US. Unionized firms have just been shrinking for many decades because they have higher costs, and non-unionized firms have been expanding because they have lower costs. This is just standard common sense that this would happen. So then there's the puzzle of, well, then what is going on with gaps in pay? The alternative to the discrimination story is that the workers are not, in fact, on average, equally productive. There are differences in productivity, and we can go and get data and see whether that would explain it. In the case of women, there's a lot of really obvious things to talk about, like women are a lot more likely to work part-time rather than full-time. That's going to give you lower earnings.
Like,
when women are working
in like actually not particularly unfair societies, isn't like pretty much all, like the most recent data says the discrimination in terms of pay gap between men and women comes down to really a parenthood gap, like mothers,
right. Well, so it's not just
non-mothers and men. In fact, non-mother women make more money than men and are better educated across most of the world.
Single child
countries have actual discrimination against women, like countries like Afghanistan, where you're literally not allowed to go to work if you're a woman. Very different. But in the sort of democratic weird West, basically, if you want to earn more than men, just don't have kids.
Right. Well, so that's a big part of it. Another one is get a STEM degree. Right. So there is a big pay gap. Men are more likely to do STEM. Women are a lot less likely, and STEM pays more. Of course, if you're a woman and you want to make more money, you can do STEM too.
I know. I wrote a very naughty blog post that said that rich girls don't like maths, which is because the data shows, which is true. Like this is what it picked up, right? That women that are in more developed, richer countries choose not to do STEM degrees because they don't have to choose STEM in order to actually live a comfortable life. And then they often end up earning less than men. And women who are often immigrants or in other parts of the world where they don't have the luxury of a soft life and they don't have the luxury of choice. Women that come from developing markets where they don't have great life outcomes unless they do STEM, choose more STEM degrees, which implies that women have a preference not to do maths, but do it if they have to.
Yeah, I mean, that all makes sense. So that's another reason. And, and it's something where you can just look at the data and see what's going on. All right, well, it's not discrimination. It's just that people want engineers because engineers can do amazing things, more amazing than what people would usually do in human resources or something like that, which isn't so, yeah, isn't
or have
as
more
far.
scalable value rather than more nuclear value.
Yes, yeah, that's
Which
another
is
way
a
of
lot of
putting
it,
it.
which comes back to the choice of having children or not. Having a child is a very nuclear source of value, whereas choosing to, go out into the world and become a politician or an activist or whatever is a much like broader circle form of value that you're trying to make. And that's going to scale differently. It's going to have different rates of return.
Yeah, and my favorite application of Beckerian thinking is the question of illegal immigration. So like in the United States, one of the very few groups that people will vocally complain about in the grocery store without looking around to make sure that no one's listening is illegal immigrants. There's a lot of antipathy towards them. And then you might say, well, given all this antipathy, we don't need a law against hiring them because people don't like them. Right now, almost everyone would laugh at that because they realize, look, that may be so, but it doesn't matter because there's always going to be some greedy employers who will hire people on their merits and don't care about whether or not you have the right papers from the government. And that's why I say, aha, that's just what Gary Becker's saying, namely that there's always going to be enough employers that just want to go and make money, that if you want to have discrimination, you've got to have the law enforce it, which is what we actually do. There's law saying you must discriminate against illegal immigrants, not that it's an option, but rather that it's mandatory.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things to sort of pick apart. Like you do go in quite a lot of the perils of nationalism and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. But I'm always struck as a citizen of a developing country who's definitely one of the global weak and not one of the global strong markets, how domestically progressive policy in strong nations, and you would definitely be living in one of those, whether that's monetary policy or immigration policy, domestically progressive policy or left-wing policy, to use your language, is often regressive or right-wing at a global scale. My favorite example there is loose monetary policy, which is domestically undeniably sort of, at least in the short term. I mean, if we don't have to look at long run effects, if you're giving more money to more freshly minted money to poor people domestically, they will get richer, like it's progressive. Whether it's long run, good for those people or not is a entirely different story. Again, you touch on that in the book, and I'm sure you'll raise a few eyebrows and upset some people on that. But at an international level, it's regressive. It makes me and my fellow citizens poorer compared to you. Like it's globally regressive. And how you manage to square that circle as a person, as an individual with values, and say that, I'm a good person. I'm on the right side of history because I'm voting for progressive policy, and just turn a blind eye to the global regressive consequences is, for me, extraordinary. But that's I
thought you were going to talk about South Africa keeping out illegal Zimbabwean immigrants, which I think would be a really good example.
Yeah, the scale. It's like we're still stronger than our neighbors. So, but it's like it's basically kind of like the bullying question or the orientation week thing that guys do at like rich private schools all over the world. Whereas like, if you get kicked by the guys above you, you kick the smaller, weaker ones below you, right? We have this whole cycle of repeating these same problems at scale. That's depressing. That's human nature, right? But I mean, you speak about this in your book too, like, or what is that sort of famous libertarian quote? Like, I'm a sort of a communist in my own home, but I'm a libertarian at the state level, as it sort of scales through all the different, from your family to your neighborhood and all the rest of it. And I think that's really what we talk about, that like at a larger level, you probably want sort of less controls and less force sharing, but in your nuclear family, the rules are quite different. Like it's not entirely fractal when it comes to human relations at all.
True enough.
But that's not a great point to sort of end this conversation. It's probably better to give you the last word and to bring it back, because I was very mean to you. I was not particularly kind, but it's because generally I think I'm politically aligned with you. I'm definitely anti-politics in general. I'm pro-freedom in general, and I'm basically, my political philosophy comes down to, don't tell me what to do and I won't tell you what to do. Like, you do you and I'll do me. Like that's my basic thing, which makes any sort of conversation about left and right leaves me usually sort of blinking into the sunlight, going like, what's the difference at the end of the day? It's amoeba strip. The more you walk to one direction, you end up back exactly where you started. If you're going to play these games of government's going to save us, right, and policies and rules and punishing the naughty is going to fix what's going on, as opposed to us just making good choices for ourselves and for for our families. But that's my piece. What is your takeaway that you hope that readers get from going through your essays? I know you don't intend to antagonize and outrage. What is it you hoping to? What is the key message you're hoping to get across there?
The key message, I would say, is that it's very important to think hard and calmly about the just way to treat other people. A lot of the reason why I wrote the essay to my daughter, and I explained this, she said, there's a part that said, Dad, why do you even care what I think about feminism? I said, well, look, here's what I'm worried about. I don't want you to feel self-pity. If you falsely believe that society is going to treat you very unfairly compared to your brothers, you're going to feel bad for yourself, and I don't think that you should. I don't want you to feel antipathy. I don't want you to feel unjustified resentment for an entire gender of people who are not, in fact, mistreating you overall. And finally, I want you to think very carefully about whether you are treating others justly. Don't make up false accusations against others. If you think that you're being mistreated, don't assume the worst. Say, well, is there actually some reason to what's going on? There was a friend who said, well, what are you going to tell your daughter about when she is not taken seriously on the job because she's a woman? What I tell her is, first of all, don't assume that you're not being taken seriously because you're a woman. Maybe people don't take you seriously because you are still learning and don't know what you're doing. Maybe they don't take you seriously because people are very egotistical and it has nothing to do with your gender. So instead, try to keep your hands clean, treat other people justly, and live a good life. And I actually have a part where I said, look, if the only way to go and get your way is to treat other people like dirt, just lose. Better to be a loser who treats other people well than to be a winner who just tramples on other people. That's how I've raised my kids. That's how I try to live my life. So, and the book, by the way, is Don't Be a Feminist, Essays on Genuine Justice. It's an Amazon exclusive. I'm not sure what it is in South African money, but in US currency, it's $12 for the paperback and $9.99 for the ebook. And there's been no increase in the price due to inflation. What's your inflation in South Africa right now?
It's higher than normal, but it's not extraordinary. So it's still like in the single.
US, we are at like 40-year high right now.
Salt. There's like the whole like Terry Pratchett Boots Index, like the inflation index is so massaged and so cherry picked. For real people like out there, it's hard. Like people are having to make choices, right? Like certainly the grant money has not kept up with even nominal inflation, which like quite frankly, a vast majority of households in our country are reliant on one way or another. So take that factoid as you like, but yeah, it's fun out here. Thanks for the inflation, Americans. Like we appreciate it. I mean, I know we haven't exactly we have got clean hands. Me contributed.
All right. Well, it's been great talking to you, Bronwyn. Really appreciate it. And if you guys are ever out in the DC area, I will be happy to buy you lunch and introduce you to a bunch of other GMU econ bloggers.
That'd be amazing. Thank you so much for giving us your time and for being generous and patient with my line of questioning. If people want to get hold of you, find you, if you don't want to be found, if there's any URLs you want us to throw out or Twitter handles with which to point people, where can people find you if you would like to be found?
So I Substack for betonit.substack.com. I'm on Twitter as @Bryan_Caplan, and all my stuff is at my personal website, www.bcaplan.com.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been fantastic.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.